Hello there my friends, and welcome back to another review, discussion, and beyond video for Warhammer books and novels. Today we're gonna continue our coverage of the always popular and enjoyable Gotrek and Felix saga. Whatever I do, it does feel like I'm always returning to this perpetually entertaining duo. Today we're gonna be talking about the third volume of the series, namely Daemonslayer, written as before by Master William King. Before we get started though, I would like to take a moment and ask everyone who enjoys these videos, or is maybe missing all my old content and wants to support me in one way or another, to check out my Patreon and Rumble pages. Rumble for all those lore videos that I lost on my old YouTube channel, and Patreon for both old and new stories, narrations, and storytelling and that kind of thing, including all the stuff that I will never be able to put on YouTube again. Do feel free to join me there as a free member and decide if all the dozens and dozens of playlists which already exist there might be worth your time. All the links that are relevant are in the video description. And now, back to your regular schedule of Gotrek and Felix. As I said, today we're gonna be covering Daemonslayer, the actually straightforward continuation and sequel of Skavenslayer, which we talked about previously. Daemonslayer, for starters, is actually a more traditionally written book with, chapters that go together into one cohesive whole. And I'm only mentioning that because, if you remember, both Trollslayer and Skavenslayer were actually more like collections of short stories in a way, instead of, regular traditional novels. Not that I'm saying that's a bad thing, Skavenslayer still is, not just one of the most entertaining Gotrek and Felix books, but also one of the funniest Warhammer fantasy books I've ever read. Anyway, here we go with Daemonslayer. And Daemonslayer is also a very important book in the saga, in my opinion, because it introduces us to several iconic and very important characters in the entire saga. Namely Max Schreiber, Ulrika, for whom Felix will be pining for half his life, but we're gonna get to that. Also the much more memorable and lovable dwarves Snorri Nosebiter and Malachi Mackayson. And anyone who says that Snorri Nosebiter isn't the best Slayer character ever, outside of Gotrek maybe, is either a liar or someone who hasn't read the books. And I'm not gonna be spoiling too much in this first half of the video, but these four characters are key elements for a lot of the Gotrek and Felix stories going forward, at least for the next 4-ish books, but they are gonna appear again after that as well. So, without going into spoilers much, since the synopsis is happening at the end of this video, what is Daemonslayer actually about? Fortunately, for those of you who might have not enjoyed the static Nuln setting from the Skavenslayer book, Daemonslayer actually takes place in multiple locations. If one can consider the Chaos Wastes exotic, although not only restricted to that, thankfully. In Daemonslayer, Gotrek and Felix join an expedition into the Chaos Wastes, traveling aboard an airship of all things, with the purpose of discovering an old dwarf hold called Karag Dûm. This place used to be a dwarf settlement a long time ago, but the Chaos Wastes expanded in the meantime and they lost contact. And other dwarves did attempt expeditions in the past to this place, but none were successful. In fact, Gotrek himself was part of one such expedition. So, in a nutshell, our legendary duo travel there. They meet a host of new characters on the way, including the major ones that we mentioned before. They do get there, they engage in some epic fighting and grimdark storytelling of the Warhammer flavor, and they eventually return. And that's the absolute summary of this book. So, in regards to the important characters that I mentioned before, I do want to say a few words about each, and try to summarize why they are so memorable and important in the long run, without spoiling too much. And because he is one of my most favorite characters, not just in Gotrek and Felix, but dwarves overall, I'll begin with the most lovable of dwarf slayers, Snorri Nosebiter. Snorri is actually an old friend of Gotrek from way before he ever met Felix. He is described as very ugly, even by Slayer standards, but also bigger, stronger, and more muscled than your average dwarf. In fact, he would probably count as 2 dwarves. He is also, and I'm saying this with as much love as possible, pretty stupid and thick-skulled. But it is one of those innocent kinds of stupidity, if you know what I mean, where even though you know you can't always get through to him, you still know that he means well, and he doesn't have an evil bone in his body. That is Snorri Nosebiter. And to the delight of readers everywhere, he is gonna be a pretty permanent presence up until Giantslayer, I believe, which is book 7. But he's gonna return in future novels as well. Snorri also has a very unique gimmick, if you wanna call it that, in that he doesn't actually remember the reason why he became a Slayer. He claims that's because he took one too many blows to the head, but it might also be because he has a literal crest of actual nails that he drove into his own skull. We do find the reason why he did that though, and it is as tragic and grimdark as you might imagine for Warhammer. Still, the reason why I like this guy so much is because, for one, he is endlessly entertaining, and secondly, despite being kind of an idiot, he can sometimes be really charming and even offer bits of unexpected wisdom every now and then. The second character I wanted to go over today is, maybe unsurprisingly, another Slayer, because dwarves are awesome like that. And this character is Malachi Mackayson. Now Malachi is a very unique character, especially for a Slayer, because he is also an engineer who actively invents and builds things for dwarves and other groups. So despite being a Slayer, he also has something approaching a more regular life, in that he doesn't perpetually just try to find things to kill in order to die. And it is he who actually designs and builds the airship that the group uses as transportation throughout this book, an airship called the Spirit of Grungni. He doesn't appear as often as Snorri in the series, but he's always memorable when he does. And I think, as kind of a joke in reference to some people in northern Scotland, I apologize if I'm mistaken though, Malachi is described as having an almost incomprehensible accent from some weird clan of an obscure dwarf hold. The third character I wanted to go over today, and maybe the most important for Felix's arc throughout maybe half of the series, is Ulrika. By her full name, one Ulrika Magdova Stragov. Now, if you haven't figured it out already, this girl is the main love interest for Felix for multiple books in the series. And even after they're not quote-unquote together anymore, you will eventually, or likely, grow tired of Felix's attitude of, oh my Ulrika. You know, this new girl, she's nice, but she's no Ulrika, and that is gonna go on for some time. At least until he grows up a bit and meets Kat. But Kat, while also an important character, is a different story which we're not gonna get into today. For a bit more context, Ulrika is a young Kislevite noblewoman, and if nothing else, she is very independent, or she likes to project that attitude. And her upcoming relationship with Felix is what I think some of us would call a toxic relationship. Not at the beginning, but it will grow into that. And it's not entirely their fault either, but while they do have the crazy hots for each other, they're also quite different from one another, and they butt their heads constantly. Now, I'm not saying that because I hate Ulrika as a character. I don't. Heck, many years ago when I read this for the first time and I was a wee lad, I could actually relate to that situation a bit. But years later, as I narrated this book, I did come to see that Ulrika was kind of a toxic presence in Felix's life. But anyway, in this volume they kinda just meet and greet and spend some time with each other. The drama comes in the later books. Last but not least for all these important characters is Max Schreiber, or by his full name Maximilian Schreiber. This guy is actually a wizard from the Gold Order, if memory serves, Although I think it's worth mentioning that at some point in the later books, one of the other authors retconned him a bit by making him a wizard of the College of Light, I believe, which is not the same as the Gold Order. Bottom line though, he is a good guy wizard who fights the forces of chaos, always. And he is also going to be part of the adventure, either continuously or recurring for later books. There's many instances where he either heals our heroes or employs his skills to save the day basically, when even Gotrek couldn't bully his way to victory. And these, in my opinion, are probably the most important characters of the saga introduced in this book. Now, for other memorable and important elements featured in Daemonslayer, returning in a somewhat diminished role but equally memorable is the inimitable Grayseer Fankwall, and also a particularly funny underling of his named Lurk Snitchtongue. This Lurk is also going to be around for 2 or 3 books, if memory serves, and has quite a lot of funny scenes as he spies for Fankwall. As I said in the beginning, there's way more locations in this book, including the construction site of the Spirit of Grungni in the mountains, a short visit to Middenheim, an introduction to both Kislev and the Chaos Wastes, and I would like to say here that if you're new to Warhammer literature, the way this book presents these 2 last locations, even if they only make a short stop in Kislev for a little while, it is actually very immersive, and I think for new readers it will only make them more interested to learn more about these regions of the old world. Kislev, if you're unaware, is the Russian-themed part of the old world. You know, like Bretonia is France, and the Empire is the Holy Roman Empire. Although there are elements of Polish and other Eastern European countries mixed in as well. Fun fact, this book actually was my introduction to Kislev as well. Daemonslayer also introduces the Chaos Wastes, like I said, which are the evil, barren, corrupted and reality-defying regions surrounding the poles of the Warhammer world. And as the group and their airship travel to this region, I think William King did a great job at showing how chaos alters the landscape and, reality itself. We get to see armies of chaos warriors and beastmen and demons and whatnot. If nothing else, we learn why chaos is bad, in a nutshell. There's even something in this book for those Lord of the Rings fans out there, as in the second half of the book we get a very Mines of Moria-esque section, with our heroes actually getting to their objective, the lost dwarf hold of Karak Dum. And there they will discover a group of dwarf survivors that they rescue after fighting some really big nasties, including the enemy big boss that the novel is named after. Who would have guessed that in a book called Daemonslayer, Gotrek was gonna slay a demon at the end? Although in a strange twist on these situations, it is actually not Gotrek that is responsible the most for defeating it. If you get to my synopsis of the book in a couple of minutes, you're gonna find out why. So, all in all, Daemonslayer is, in my opinion, a great continuation to the adventures of Gotrek and Felix. Not only does it expand on the roster of memorable characters who do appear later in the next books, it does take us to some very different locations. It expands the lore of the world, especially if you are new to the universe, and even sets up narrative elements from the books that will follow this one, like Beastslayer or Dragonslayer. All in all, a very entertaining read. Next, we will be continuing with the synopsis, but if you made it this far, I would like to say thank you for watching or listening. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, do let me know in the comments. Is Daemonslayer among your favorite Warhammer books? Let us know why, or why not. If you have suggestions for other books I could review or should cover in this series, you can let me know that as well. Now, for the last bit of the video, a synopsis of Daemonslayer. And I have said this before, but I'm gonna keep on saying it because obviously not everyone watches all these videos. But these synopses are not gonna be detailing every single plot twist or every character action in the story. I'm doing this more for those of you who want to know what happens in broader lines in the novel, but maybe don't have the time or the means to read the book yourselves. I also don't want to reduce your enjoyment of it by spoiling literally everything. So, once upon a time, at the beginning of this book, Gotrek and Felix are drinking at an inn when they are approached by a Snorri Nosebiter and another character that is gonna last for the next couple of books, a dwarf called Varek. They learn that they have been summoned by one Borek Forkbeard to join an expedition to Karak Dum, an ancient dwarfhold lost deep in the Chaos Wastes. Now, Gotrek, Snorri, and this Borek were the sole survivors of a previous, failed expedition to find the city. Despite believing that the quest is madness, Gotrek does agree to travel to Borek's base, in a place called the Lonely Tower. And since Felix has to accompany him no matter what, Felix goes as well. Here they arrive, but unaware that the inimitable Gracier Fankwol is planning to assault the base and steal dwarfish technology, obviously with a focus on the airship being built there by Malachi Mackayson. Angered to find his nemesis again, Fankwol orders the attack early, but the disciplined dwarves there defeat the Skaven with the help of Gotrek and Felix. Also during this chaos, Felix kills, I think it is Bone Ripper 3.0 or 2.0, anyway, the latest Bone Ripper, the guardian of Fankwol. After that, Felix is saved from the surviving gutter runners by Malachi Mackayson, a genius engineer turned slayer who does make his first appearance, like I said earlier, in this novel. Borek explains the grand plan. The crew are gonna fly over the mutating chaos wastes in the Spirit of Grungni, which is the massively, magically warded vessel designed by Mackayson. Gotrek and Snorri agree to join, and Felix is bound by his oath to follow. Also unknown to them, Fankwol's lackey, Lurk Snitchtongue, stows away on the vessel to spy on them. The airship then stops in Middenheim to pick up supplies, and we meet our next two passengers, Ulrika Magdova and the wizard Max Schreiber. Even as early as this, there was a bit of a romantic rivalry for Ulrika's affections between Max and Felix. They do get to Ulrika's father, one Ivan Petrovich Stragov, at a mansion, fortified mansion I think it was, in the steppes of Kislev. And there they stop briefly to get more supplies and to introduce us to a bit of Kislevite culture. It is also here that Felix and Ulrika kind of fall for one another, and they spend a passionate night together. But for this story, Ulrika actually stays behind, and they're only gonna meet again when Felix returns with the airship. While navigating the wastes, a storm damages the airship and causes the stowed-away Lurk to actually mutate into a mutant Skaven. Gotrek, Felix and Snorri descend into a ruined city to investigate, although this is not Karak Dum yet. But the ship is blown away, and they have to fight a mad hermit and a bunch of other beastmen and chaos nasties. But the spirit of Grungni returns and saves them in the nick of time. They resume their journey, and they do reach Karak Dum and sneak inside. Here they discover some of the Hold's survivors, who are waging a desperate guerrilla war against the chaos monsters and beastmen and whatnot, led by one King Thangrim Firebeard. And here we learn about one of the disturbing properties of the Chaos Wastes, namely altering time. Because while in the outside world 2 centuries had passed since this hold was lost in the Chaos Wastes, to the survivors only 6 months had passed. And this does explain a bit how they managed to, survive in this hellish environment. The king reveals that Gotrek's weapon, his mighty axe, is actually the Hold's lost Rune Master's axe, which Gotrek discovered in a cave years prior as he was actually returning from that failed expedition. The return of the axe actually supposedly fulfills a prophecy signaling the death of the city's tormentor, a bloodthirster of Khorne, which is a greater demon. Soon after that, this greater demon breaches the throne room with a beastman army. He kills the king and wounds Snorri before Gotrek steps in to fight it. But not even Gotrek could entirely best the greater demon of Khorne at this point. However, in a surprising twist, which I mentioned a bit earlier, It is Felix who grabs the Hammer of Fate, which was actually the artifact that the expedition went there to find to begin with, and Felix manages to grab this weapon and hurl it as the greater demon was about to kill Gotrek. The demon is severely wounded, and Gotrek manages to finish it off. The Beastman army is routed, and whatever is left of the survivors of Karak-Dum are rescued to the spirit of Grugni. Although unfortunately at this point there were just like a few dozen of them left. Felix, Gotrek, Varek, Borek, and everyone else important boards the airship again, and with the recovered Hammer of Fate, so at least they achieve something, and they begin their triumphant journey out of the wastes. And the story does continue right after this in, I think it is Beastslayer, or maybe Dragonslayer, I always get those two confused. But anyway, we're gonna see what happens in the next review. And now for those of you who got to this point, I'd just like to say thank you again for listening, and Sigmar's blessings be upon you.